Margaret stared at her phone screen, watching Emma's name flash for the third time in 5 minutes. Each ring felt like a hammer against her chest. She knew what this call was about, the same thing that had been eating away at their relationship for the past 2 months, the will. "Hi, Grandma." Emma's voice came through cold, distant. Gone was the warm Nana that had melted Margaret's heart for 23 years. "Emma, sweetheart, I was just thinking about you. We need to talk." The words cut through Margaret's attempt at normalcy like a blade. "About what we discussed last time." Margaret's arthritis-worn fingers tightened around the phone. She was sitting in her favorite armchair in the living room of the house she'd called home for 47 years, the same house that was now at the center of this family storm. Through the lace curtains, she could see the oak tree Harold had planted when Emma was born, its branches now thick enough to shade half the front yard. "Emma, I've already explained my decision. The house goes to your father and Uncle David equally, just like we always planned. The charitable donations remain as they are. Nothing has changed since your grandfather and I made these arrangements 15 years ago." The silence on the other end stretched so long that Margaret wondered if the call had dropped. Then came Emma's voice, sharper now, carrying a tone Margaret had never heard directed at her before. "Nothing has changed. Really, Grandma. I've been taking care of you for 3 years. 3 years. Who drove you to every doctor's appointment when Dad was too busy with his new family? Who spent every Sunday here helping you with groceries and cleaning? Who held your hand through Grandpa's funeral while Dad couldn't even be bothered to help plan it properly?" Each word hit Margaret like a physical blow. The accusations weren't entirely wrong, and that made them hurt even more. Emma had been there. Through Harold's decline, through the grief, through the lonely months that followed. But this wasn't how family was supposed to work, was it? Love wasn't supposed to come with a price tag. "Sweetheart, I appreciate everything you've done. You know I do. But my will isn't a reward system. It's based on what your grandfather and I believed was fair and right." "Fair?" Emma's laugh was bitter, nothing like the bright sound Margaret remembered from Emma's childhood in this very house. "Is it fair that I gave up dating, gave up social plans, gave up my own life to be here for you, while Dad shows up for holidays and gets half of everything? Is it fair that I'm drowning in student loans from nursing school, the degree I got specifically so I could take better care of you, while you're leaving $250,000 to some charity that doesn't even know your name?" Margaret's chest tightened. The Alzheimer's Foundation donation had been Harold's idea, chosen after watching his own mother fade away in the final years. It meant something to her, represented their shared fear and their hope that others might be spared that particular hell. But explaining this to Emma right now felt impossible. "The foundation does important work, Emma. You know how Grandpa felt about... Grandpa's been dead for 2 years. The words exploded through the phone. "And I'm the one who's been here. I'm the one who found you on the kitchen floor when you fell last winter. I'm the one who knows you take your blood pressure medicine with orange juice because you can't swallow pills with water anymore. I'm the one who sits with you when you can't sleep because you miss him so much you can barely breathe." Margaret's vision blurred with tears. Each fact Emma listed was true, painfully true, but mixed with the guilt was something else. A growing resentment at having her love measured and weighed like groceries at the checkout counter. "Emma, I never asked you to do any of that. I never asked you to sacrifice your life for mine." The words hung in the air like poison. Margaret regretted them instantly, but they were out there now, carrying a truth that neither of them wanted to acknowledge. "No, you didn't ask." Emma's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I did it because I love you. I did it because family is supposed to take care of each other. But I guess love and loyalty don't mean much when it comes to making things official, do they? That's not fair, Emma. You know I love you. You know how much you mean to me. But love isn't something you can measure in dollars and property deeds. Isn't it? Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like Dad's love is worth exactly half a house, and mine is worth a pat on the head and a "thank you, sweetie." Margaret stood up from her chair, her knees protesting, and walked to the mantelpiece, where photos chronicled their family's history. There was Emma at 5, gap-toothed and grinning, sitting on Harold's shoulders in this very living room. Emma at 16, rolling her eyes at some joke of Harold's but unable to hide her smile. Emma at her nursing school graduation, beaming between Margaret and Harold, so proud and full of dreams. When had everything become so complicated? "Emma, your grandfather and I made our decisions based on what we thought was right. David is Harold's son too. He has a family, responsibilities. And yes, he may not have been as present as you, but that doesn't mean he loves me less or deserves less consideration. Doesn't it?" Emma shot back. "When's the last time Uncle David called you? When's the last time he visited without it being a holiday or obligation? I know for a fact he hasn't been here since Easter. And it's almost October. Margaret couldn't argue with that. David lived only 40 minutes away, but might as well have been on another continent for how often she saw him. His visits were brief, polite, and always seemed to involve him checking his phone more than making conversation. He's busy with his career, Emma. He provides for his family, that's important too. And what about me providing care for you? What about me putting my own life on hold? Doesn't that count for anything? The pain in Emma's voice was unmistakable now, cutting through the anger to reveal something deeper. Margaret recognized it because she'd felt it herself, the exhaustion of being the one who always shows up, who always carries the load while others reap the benefits of your sacrifice. But recognizing it didn't make changing it any easier. Emma, I need you to understand something. If I change my will now based on who's been more present or helpful, what message does that send? That my love has conditions? That family members need to compete for my affection and my assets? That's not the legacy I want to leave. And what about the message you're sending now? Emma's voice cracked. That sacrifice doesn't matter. That showing up doesn't matter. That I could disappear tomorrow and nothing would change in your precious will because Dad still gets his half and your charity still gets its donation. The question hit Margaret like a slap, because if she was being honest, completely brutally honest, Emma disappearing would change everything. The thought of it made her stomach clench with panic. Who would she call when she couldn't open a jar? Who would drive her to her appointments when her eyes got too bad for her to drive safely? Who would sit with her on the anniversary of Harold's death and let her cry without trying to fix anything? But admitting that felt like admitting that Emma was right, that love could be measured in service, that presence had a price. Emma, you're my granddaughter. You'll always be my granddaughter. Will or no will, that doesn't change. Doesn't it? Emma's voice was barely audible now, because it feels like it already has. The line went quiet except for the sound of Emma's breathing, unsteady and tearful. Margaret pressed the phone closer to her ear, as if she could somehow bridge the distance that had opened between them. I need you to think about this, Grandma. Really think about it. Not about what Grandpa would have wanted. Not about what's fair to Dad or Uncle David, but about what's right. About who's actually been your family these past few years. Emma, I have to go. I have a shift at the hospital in an hour. Will I see you this Sunday? Margaret asked, hating the desperation she heard in her own voice. The pause was long enough that Margaret's heart began to sink. I don't know, Grandma. I honestly don't know. The line went dead, leaving Margaret standing alone in her living room, surrounded by decades of family photos and memories, wondering how love had become so complicated. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows of the house that had become the center of everything falling apart. She sank back into her armchair and stared at the phone in her lap, replaying every word of the conversation. Emma's accusations circled in her mind like vultures. Was she being unfair? Was she so committed to the principle of treating the family equally that she was blind to the reality of who had actually been treating her like family? But changing the will now felt like giving in to emotional manipulation, like setting a precedent that love could be bought and sold. Harold would have been horrified at the idea of family members competing for inheritance like contestants on some twisted game show, wouldn't he? Margaret closed her eyes and tried to imagine what Harold would say if he could see them now. But for the first time since his death, she couldn't hear his voice in her mind. The silence was deafening. Sunday morning arrived grey and drizzling, matching Margaret's mood perfectly. She'd been awake since 5 a.m., listening to the rain tap against her bedroom window and trying not to check her phone every 10 minutes to see if Emma had called. By 9 o'clock, she'd given up pretending she wasn't waiting and had positioned herself in the kitchen with a clear view of the driveway, nursing her third cup of coffee. The Sunday routine had been sacred for almost 3 years. Emma would arrive around 10:30 with groceries and that bright smile that could chase away any shadow from Margaret's week. They'd unpack everything together, Emma chattering about her patients at the hospital or some new recipe she wanted to try. Then they'd tackle whatever household task Margaret had been putting off, changing light bulbs she couldn't reach, reorganizing closets, or simply deep cleaning areas that her aging body couldn't handle anymore. But it was never really about the chores. It was about the company, the laughter, the way Emma would find Harold's old jazz records and dance around the kitchen while they cooked lunch together. It was about having someone to talk to who actually listened, who remembered the stories, who cared about the details of Margaret's shrinking world. Now at 11:15, the driveway remained empty except for the puddles forming in the cracks Harold had always meant to fix. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message, and her heart leaped before she even looked at the screen. But it wasn't Emma. It was her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, asking if she needed anything from the grocery store since she was making a run. The kindness of the gesture made Margaret's throat tight. Even her neighbors had noticed the pattern, had seen Emma's car every Sunday, had probably wondered where the helpful granddaughter was today. She texted back a polite decline and returned to staring out the window. This was ridiculous. She was a grown woman perfectly capable of spending a Sunday alone. She'd done it for decades before Emma started coming around. She could certainly do it now, but the silence in the house felt different today, hostile almost. Every creak of the floorboards reminded her that she was alone. Every shadow in her peripheral vision made her turn, expecting to see Harold settling into his favorite chair with the newspaper, or Emma bouncing through the door with arms full of grocery bags. By noon, Margaret couldn't stand it anymore. She grabbed her purse and car keys, determined to drive to the grocery store herself. She'd show Emma that she didn't need taking care of, that she was still perfectly independent. The keys felt heavier than usual in her hand as she stood by the front door. When was the last time she'd driven somewhere by herself? Emma had been handling all the errands for so long that Margaret couldn't even remember. The thought made her pause, one hand on the doorknob. What if her reflexes weren't as good as they used to be? What if she couldn't see the road signs clearly? What if she got confused and couldn't find her way home? These were the fears she'd never voiced to Emma, the vulnerabilities she'd hidden behind stubborn independence. But they were real, lurking beneath every confident assertion that she was fine and managing just fine. Thank you. Margaret hung the keys back on their hook and sank onto the small bench in her entryway. The truth was she wasn't managing fine. She hadn't been for a while. Emma's presence every Sunday hadn't just been company, it had been a lifeline. And now that lifeline was gone, cut by Margaret's own stubborn principles. The afternoon stretched ahead of her like a desert. She tried reading, but the words blurred together. She tried watching television, but every commercial seemed to feature happy families, grandparents and grandchildren laughing together over Sunday dinner. She tried calling her sister Janet in Phoenix, but got voicemail and remembered that Janet was probably at her book club. At 3 o'clock, she found herself standing in Emma's old bedroom, the room that had been her sanctuary during high school when things got tense at home, and later during college breaks when she'd come to visit. Margaret had kept it exactly the same, down to the faded posters on the walls and the stuffed elephant Emma had won at a county fair when she was 16. She sat on the narrow bed and picked up the framed photo from the nightstand. It was from Emma's nursing school graduation, all three of them beaming at the camera, Harold's arm around Margaret's shoulders, Emma between them in her cap and gown, her whole future spread out ahead of her like a promise. "I'm going to take care of people," Emma had said that day, eyes shining with purpose. "I'm going to make a difference." And she had. She'd made a difference in so many lives, her patients at the hospital, her friends, her family, especially Margaret's life. The irony wasn't lost on her that Emma had chosen a profession dedicated to caring for others, and Margaret was now punishing her for that same impulse when it came to family. But was it punishment, or was it principle? Margaret set the photo down and walked to the window that overlooked the backyard. Harold's garden was overgrown now, weeds choking out the roses he'd tended so carefully. Another thing Emma had quietly taken on, keeping the plants alive even though gardening wasn't really her passion. She'd done it because she knew it mattered to Margaret, because she understood that letting Harold's roses die felt like losing another piece of him. The realization hit Margaret like a physical blow. Emma hadn't just been helping with errands and appointments. She'd been preserving Harold's memory, maintaining the connections that kept this house feeling like a home instead of a mausoleum. Her phone rang, jolting her from her thoughts. David's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, Margaret felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he'd heard about the tension with Emma and was calling to help mediate. Maybe he was finally going to step up and be more present. "Hi, Mom, how are you doing?" "Oh, getting by." Margaret settled back on Emma's bed, suddenly exhausted. Good. Listen, I'm calling because Sarah mentioned we never got a chance to properly thank you for the birthday gift you sent Tyler. The baseball glove was perfect. He's been using it for practice every day." Margaret smiled despite her mood. Tyler was David's 12-year-old son, her youngest grandson, and his enthusiasm for baseball reminded her so much of Harold at that age. "I'm glad he likes it." Emma helped me pick it out. She said the brand was important for his age group. There was a slight pause on David's end. "Emma, when did you talk to Emma about Tyler's gift?" "She drove me to the sporting goods store. It was, 3 months ago now. We spent an hour looking at different gloves, and she called that friend of hers who coaches Little League to make sure we got the right size." "Huh, I didn't realize Emma was still... I knew you two were close, but I didn't know she was helping with stuff like that." The casual dismissal in David's voice made Margaret's chest tighten. "She's been helping with a lot of things, David, for quite a while now." "That's nice of her. I keep meaning to get over there more often, but work has been crazy and Sarah's been dealing with her mum's health issues." Margaret listened to the familiar litany of excuses, each one perfectly reasonable and completely inadequate. David was a good man, she knew that. He wasn't neglecting her out of malice or indifference. He was just busy, overwhelmed, caught up in the immediate demands of his own life. In his mind, she was probably doing fine, managing on her own, not really needing much. He had no idea that Emma was the reason that illusion could persist. "David, can I ask you something?" "Of course, Mom. If something happened to me tomorrow, who do you think would handle the arrangements? Who would know where I keep important documents, who my doctors are, what medications I'm taking?" David was quiet for a long moment. I suppose Emma would probably know those things better than I would. She's always been more detail-oriented, as if caring for one's grandmother was simply a matter of being organized." "She would," Margaret agreed quietly. "She knows all of those things because she's been living this with me, David. Not just visiting or calling, but actually sharing the burden of my daily life." "Mom, are you okay? You sound, I don't know, sad." Margaret closed her eyes. How could she explain that she was drowning in a sea of her own making? That her principles, which had seemed so clear and righteous just days ago, now felt like anchors pulling her under. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just feeling a little lonely today." "Oh, well, maybe Emma could come over? Doesn't she usually visit on Sundays?" The innocent question was like salt in a wound. David didn't even realize that Emma's visits weren't random acts of kindness. They were the carefully maintained structure that allowed Margaret to feel less alone, less forgotten, less like a burden waiting to be shouldered. "She's busy today. That's too bad. Hey, maybe Sarah and I should plan a visit soon. It's been too long." "That would be nice," Margaret said, knowing it probably wouldn't happen for another month or two, if at all. After they hung up, Margaret remained sitting on Emma's bed, staring at the photograph in her hands. The three of them looked so happy in that moment, so certain of their place in each other's lives. Harold's eyes were crinkled with pride. Margaret was glowing with joy, and Emma looked like she could conquer the world. What would Harold say about all this? Would he understand Margaret's position, or would he think she was being foolishly stubborn? She remembered something he'd told her once, years ago, when they were discussing his own parents' estate. His father had left everything to Harold's older brother, explaining that the farm needed to stay intact, and Harold had made his own way in the city. Harold had never gotten over the feeling that his years of caring for his aging parents had been dismissed, that his brother's proximity had been valued over Harold's devotion. "It wasn't about the money," he'd said. "It was about feeling like my love didn't count for anything because I'd chosen a different path." The memory hit Margaret like a revelation. Emma wasn't asking for her inheritance because she was greedy. She was asking for recognition that her path, the path of service, of sacrifice, of showing up, had value. She was asking to be seen. As the afternoon faded into evening, Margaret found herself thinking about all the small moments she'd taken for granted. Emma remembering that she liked her tea with honey when she was sick. Emma knowing exactly which channel to turn to for the evening news. Emma laughing at Harold's old jokes when Margaret retold them, even though she'd heard them a dozen times before. These weren't the grand gestures that wills and estates were supposed to measure, but they were the threads that had held Margaret's life together when everything else was falling apart. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the emptiness in the house felt vast and echoing. Margaret made herself a simple dinner and ate it alone at the kitchen table, the silence broken only by the tick of the clock and the hum of the refrigerator. For the first time in 3 years, Sunday felt like exactly what it was, the longest day of the week. 3 weeks passed without a word from Emma, and Margaret felt each day like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. She'd managed to maintain the facade of independence, grocery delivery from the store, a cleaning service she'd reluctantly hired, rides from a local senior transportation service for her doctor's appointments. But the efficiency of paid services couldn't fill the Emma-shaped hole in her daily routine. It was on a Thursday morning, as Margaret struggled to reach a can of soup from the top shelf in her pantry, that everything came crashing down. Literally, she'd been standing on her tiptoes, stretching her arm up toward the Campbell's tomato soup, Emma's favorite, the one she always heated up for them to share during their Sunday visits. Margaret's fingertips barely grazed the can when her balance shifted. She felt herself tilting backward, her arthritic knees buckling, her arms flailing for something, anything to stop her fall. The impact with the hardwood kitchen floor knocked the wind from her lungs and sent shooting pain through her left hip. For several terrifying minutes, she lay there gasping, staring up at the ceiling fixture she and Harold had installed 30 years ago, wondering if this was how it would end, alone on her kitchen floor, reaching for soup that reminded her of better days. When she finally caught her breath, Margaret tried to sit up. The pain in her hip was intense, but manageable. She wasn't seriously injured, just shaken and embarrassed by her own vulnerability. But as she struggled to get to her feet, using the kitchen island for support, a darker realization settled over her. She had no one to call. Well, that wasn't entirely true. She could call David, but he was 3 hours away in the middle of a workday, and calling him would mean admitting that she wasn't as independent as she'd been pretending to be. She could call 911, but the thought of paramedics and emergency rooms and all the questions and forms and fuss made her stomach clench. She could call Mrs. Chen, but that felt like an admission of defeat somehow. The person she wanted to call was Emma. Emma, who would drop everything and rush over. Emma, who would check her over with trained nurses' hands and make sure she was really okay. Emma, who would help her to the living room and make her tea and sit with her until the shaking stopped and the fear faded. But Emma wasn't speaking to her anymore. Margaret managed to pull herself upright and hobble to her bedroom, where she spent the rest of the day moving carefully and taking frequent breaks. Every step reminded her of how fragile her independence really was, how quickly everything could change. The fall hadn't seriously injured her, but it had shattered her illusions about self-sufficiency. That evening, as she sat in her chair with an ice pack on her hip, Margaret's phone rang. For a wild moment, her heart soared. Maybe Emma had somehow sensed that she needed her, the way she used to when Emma was little and would call right when Margaret was thinking about her. But it was Janet calling from Phoenix. "Maggie, I've been meaning to call all week. How are things?" "Oh, you know, same as always." Margaret winced as she shifted position, the lie slipping out automatically. "How's Emma? Still coming around to help out?" The innocent question hit like a blade. Margaret found herself unable to answer, her throat closing up with unshed tears. "Maggie, are you there? We had a disagreement about the will. She hasn't been by in a few weeks." "Oh, honey." Janet's voice immediately softened with understanding. "What kind of disagreement?" The whole story came pouring out. Emma's years of devotion, the equal split between David and his uncle, the charitable donation, Emma's hurt and anger, the terrible silence that had followed. Margaret found herself crying as she spoke, the tears she'd been holding back for weeks finally breaking free. "And today I fell," she confessed. "Nothing serious, just reaching for something on a high shelf, but I was lying there on the floor, and all I wanted was to call Emma. But I can't, because I've been too stubborn to admit she might be right about some things." Janet listened without interrupting, the way she'd been doing since they were children. When Margaret finished, her sister was quiet for a long moment. "Maggie, can I tell you something? Something I probably should have told you years ago?" "What?" "When Mum was dying and you were the one driving 3 hours every weekend to sit with her, while I was too busy with my job and my social life to visit more than once a month. I always assumed I'd inherit equally with you, and I did. But looking back now, that wasn't fair. You earned something I didn't, and Mum never acknowledged that." Margaret felt her breath catch. "Janet, I used to tell myself it didn't matter, that family should be equal no matter what. But the truth is, I let you carry the burden of her care while I lived my life. And when she died and left us each half of everything, part of me knew it was wrong. I just never had the courage to say so." The admission hung between them across the miles, weighted with years of unspoken truth. "I still believe in fairness," Janet continued, "but maybe fairness isn't always about equal treatment. Maybe sometimes it's about equal recognition of different contributions." After they hung up, Margaret sat in her darkened living room, Janet's words echoing in her mind. She thought about her own mother, who had indeed died, leaving everything split equally between her daughters, despite Margaret's countless weekends spent caring for her in her final years. At the time, Margaret had told herself it didn't matter, that she hadn't cared for her mother in order to earn inheritance. But if she was honest, truly honest, it had stung, not because she'd wanted more money, but because it had felt like her sacrifice was invisible, unacknowledged, unimportant. Was that how Emma felt now? Margaret looked around her living room, seeing it with fresh eyes. The family photos that Emma had helped her arrange after Harold's funeral. The throw pillows Emma had insisted on buying, because this place needs some color, Nana. The small changes and improvements that had made this house feel less like a shrine to the past and more like a place where life continued. Emma hadn't just been helping with errands and medical appointments. She'd been helping Margaret rebuild her life after Harold's death, creating new routines and relationships that made each day bearable. She'd been giving Margaret the gift of not feeling forgotten. And how had Margaret repaid that gift? By treating Emma's devotion as nice but irrelevant, as extra credit that was appreciated but not rewarded. The next morning, Margaret called her lawyer, Robert Hendricks, who had handled the family's legal matters for over 20 years. "Margaret, good to hear from you. How can I help?" "I need to discuss my will, Robert. I'm thinking about making some changes." "Of course, what kind of changes did you have in mind?" Margaret took a deep breath. "I want to increase Emma's inheritance. She's been more than a granddaughter to me these past few years. She's been family in the truest sense, and I think that should be recognized." "I see. And how would you like to structure this? Are you thinking of reducing the other beneficiaries proportionally?" The question forced Margaret to confront the practical reality of her decision. If she wanted to leave Emma a more substantial inheritance, the money had to come from somewhere. David's share, Uncle David's share, or the charitable donation. "I need to think about the specifics," she admitted, "but I know I want Emma to receive something meaningful, something that reflects what she's meant to me. Would you like to schedule an appointment to discuss the options? We could look at different scenarios and their implications." Margaret glanced at the calendar on her kitchen counter. Emma's birthday was in 2 weeks, her 24th birthday, which they'd planned to celebrate together with dinner at Emma's favorite Italian restaurant. "Yes, I'd like that, but Robert, could we do this quickly? I have some family relationships I need to repair." After scheduling the appointment for the following Tuesday, Margaret stood in her kitchen, staring at her phone. The conversation with Janet had shifted something fundamental in her thinking, but she still wasn't sure how to bridge the gap with Emma. A simple phone call didn't feel adequate after 3 weeks of silence and years of misunderstanding. She needed to do something bigger, something that showed Emma she'd been heard and valued. But what? The answer came to her as she looked out the kitchen window at Harold's overgrown garden. Emma had been tending those roses for 2 years, not because she loved gardening, but because she understood they were a connection to Harold, a living memorial that Margaret couldn't bear to lose. If Margaret wanted to show Emma that her care and devotion mattered, maybe she needed to start by caring for something Emma cared about. Margaret grabbed her gardening gloves from the mudroom and headed outside. Her hip still ached from yesterday's fall, and her knees protested as she knelt beside the rose bushes, but she pushed through the discomfort. She had work to do. As she pulled weeds and trimmed dead branches, Margaret found herself thinking about all the ways Emma had quietly tended to things that mattered to her. Not just the garden, but Margaret's dignity, her independence, her sense of being valued and needed. Emma had been gardening in Margaret's life for years, nurturing growth and preventing decay, asking for nothing more than recognition that her efforts mattered. The sun climbed higher as Margaret worked, and neighbors began to emerge for their morning routines. Mrs. Chen waved from her driveway and called out a greeting. Mr. Peterson stopped on his morning walk to comment on how nice the roses were looking. "Your granddaughter usually tends these, doesn't she?" he asked. "Haven't seen her around lately." "No," Margaret replied, brushing dirt from her gloves, "but I'm hoping that will change soon." As she spoke the words, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Real, concrete hope that maybe it wasn't too late to make things right. That maybe love could be measured not just in principles, but in actions. That maybe admitting you were wrong wasn't a sign of weakness, but of wisdom. If you've ever had to swallow your pride to save a relationship that mattered, let me know in the comments which country you're listening from. Sometimes the hardest conversations are the most important ones. Margaret spent the weekend rehearsing conversations in her head, each imaginary exchange with Emma ending differently. Sometimes Emma forgave her immediately, sometimes she hung up, sometimes she listened but remained distant and polite. By Monday morning, Margaret realized that no amount of mental preparation could predict how Emma would actually respond. She just had to take the leap. But first, she had her appointment with Robert Hendricks. Sitting in the familiar leather chair across from his mahogany desk, Margaret felt the weight of the decision she was about to make. Robert had represented the family for decades. He'd drawn up Harold's original will, had guided them through various legal matters, had been there through births and deaths and everything in between. If anyone would understand the complexity of what she was trying to do, it would be him. "I've been thinking about our conversation on Friday," Robert began, adjusting his glasses as he opened her file. You mentioned wanting to recognize Emma's contributions more substantially. I've drafted a few different scenarios for your consideration. He spread 3 documents across the desk, each representing a different approach to restructuring her estate. Margaret studied them carefully, her lawyer's explanations washing over her as she tried to process the implications of each choice. The first option reduced David and his uncle's shares proportionally, giving Emma a third equal share of the house and liquid assets. The second maintained their shares but reduced the charitable donation to create Emma's inheritance. The third was more complex. It gave Emma the house entirely, while David and his uncle split the remaining financial assets. "I need to ask," Robert said gently, "what's driving this change? Not that you need to justify your decisions, but understanding your motivations helps me ensure we structure this properly." Margaret set down the papers and looked out the window at the busy street below. How could she explain that she was trying to correct not just a legal document, but a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of love and family? "Emma has been my lifeline these past few years," she said finally. "Not just helping with errands, but truly caring for me. She's shown me what family should look like, and I've been too blind to see it." Margaret paused, gathering her courage. "I fell last week, Robert. Nothing serious, but lying there on my kitchen floor, the only person I wanted to call was Emma, and I couldn't, because I'd hurt her so badly she's not speaking to me anymore." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "And you believe adjusting her inheritance will help repair that relationship?" "I hope so. But more than that, I think it's simply the right thing to do. I've been so focused on being fair that I forgot about being just." They spent the next hour working through the details. Margaret ultimately chose a modified version of the first option. Emma would receive 40% of the estate, including the house, while David and his uncle would each receive 25% of the remaining assets. The charitable donation would be reduced, but not eliminated. "This feels right," Margaret said as she signed the new will. "It reflects reality instead of just principle." "I'll have this filed properly and get you copies by the end of the week," Robert assured her. "And Margaret, for what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. Family dynamics are never simple, but love should be recognized." Walking out of the law office, Margaret felt lighter than she had in weeks. The legal changes were just paperwork, but they represented something deeper, an acknowledgement that Emma's love and sacrifice had value, that they deserved recognition beyond simple gratitude. Now came the harder part, telling Emma. That evening, Margaret drove to Emma's apartment complex for the first time in over a year. It was a modest place in a decent neighborhood, the kind of building where young professionals just starting out could afford to live. Margaret had helped Emma with the security deposit when she'd first moved out of the dorm after nursing school, proud that her granddaughter was making her own way in the world. Now, sitting in her car in the parking lot, Margaret felt like an intruder. Emma's little blue Honda was parked in its usual spot, and lights were on in what Margaret remembered was the living room window. Emma was home, probably just finishing dinner, maybe watching the evening news or reading one of those medical journals she was always studying. Margaret's hands trembled as she turned off the engine. What if Emma refused to see her? What if she'd hardened her heart completely against forgiveness? What if 3 weeks of silence had been too long and the damage was irreparable? The walk to Emma's door felt like the longest 20 yards of Margaret's life. She stood outside apartment 2B for several minutes, listening to the muffled sound of the television inside, trying to summon the courage to knock. When she finally did, the sound seemed to echo through the entire building. Footsteps approached the door and Margaret heard the peephole cover slide open. A long pause, then the sound of multiple locks being undone. Emma opened the door wearing scrubs. She'd probably just gotten home from a shift at the hospital. Her face was carefully neutral, but Margaret could see the surprise and wariness in her eyes. "Grandma, what are you doing here?" "I came to apologize," Margaret said simply, "and to tell you that you were right about some things." Emma stood in the doorway for a long moment, studying Margaret's face as if trying to determine whether this was genuine or just another attempt to manipulate her back into the old pattern of care without recognition. "You could have called," Emma said finally. "Some conversations need to happen face to face." Emma stepped aside, allowing Margaret to enter the small but cozy apartment. It was exactly what Margaret had expected. Clean, organized, filled with plants that somehow thrived despite Emma's demanding schedule. Medical textbooks were stacked on the coffee table next to a half-eaten sandwich and a cup of tea that had gone cold. "You were on your way to eat," Margaret observed. "I should have called first." "It's fine. I was just having a quick dinner before studying." Emma gestured toward the couch. "Do you want to sit down?" They settled on opposite ends of the small sofa, the distance between them feeling vast despite the cramped quarters. Margaret noticed a photo on the side table, the three of them at last year's Thanksgiving. Harold's absence still fresh enough to make the smiles look forced, but their closeness still evident in the way they leaned into each other. "I changed my will today," Margaret began, deciding that directness was better than dancing around the issue. Emma's expression didn't change, but Margaret saw her hands tighten slightly in her lap. "You don't have to do that because of our fight, Grandma. I never wanted you to feel pressured into—" "You didn't pressure me. You opened my eyes." Margaret leaned forward, needing Emma to understand. "My sister called me last week and told me something I'd never known. When our mother was dying, I was the one who drove 3 hours every weekend to care for her while Janet lived her life. And when Mom died, she left us everything equally. Janet said she always knew that wasn't really fair, but she never had the courage to say so." Emma listened without speaking, her nurse's training evident in the way she gave Margaret her complete attention. "I realized I was repeating the same pattern with you, accepting your care and devotion, while planning to treat you exactly the same as family members who hadn't earned it." Margaret's voice cracked slightly. "That wasn't fair to you, Emma, and more than that, it wasn't right." "What did you change?" Emma asked quietly. Margaret explained the new arrangement, the house, the increased inheritance, the recognition that years of faithful care should mean something tangible. As she spoke, she watched Emma's face carefully, looking for signs of relief or satisfaction or vindication. Instead, Emma began to cry. "I never wanted your money, Grandma," she said through her tears. "I wanted to matter to you. I wanted you to see that I was here, that I chose to be here when no one else was. You do matter to me. You matter more than I ever told you, and that's my failing, not yours." Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so familiar from her childhood that Margaret's heart ached with the sweetness of it. "I've been so angry," Emma admitted, "not just about the will, but about feeling invisible, about giving up so much of my life and having it treated like it was just what I was supposed to do, because I'm a woman, because I'm a nurse, because I'm the one who lives closest." "You gave up things?" Margaret asked, realizing there might be sacrifices she wasn't even aware of. Emma laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I turned down a job in Seattle last year, a really good job at a research hospital. I told them I couldn't move because my grandmother needed me." She looked directly at Margaret. "And when I told you about the job offer, you said, 'That's nice, dear,' and went back to watching your show like it didn't matter that I'd chosen you over my career." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. She'd remembered Emma mentioning something about a job offer, but she'd been distracted, focused on some television program, and hadn't realized the significance of what Emma was telling her. "Oh, sweetheart, I had no idea. I know you didn't. That's what hurt so much. My whole life was revolving around taking care of you and you barely noticed." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of years of miscommunication and unspoken sacrifices settling between them. Finally, Margaret reached across the space separating them and took Emma's hand. "I noticed more than you think," she said softly. "I just didn't know how to tell you how grateful I was without making you feel obligated. I was terrified that if I acknowledged how much I needed you, you'd feel trapped." Emma squeezed her grandmother's hand. "And I was terrified that if I didn't keep proving how valuable I was, you'd forget about me entirely." "Never," Margaret said fiercely. "You're the light in my days, Emma. You have been since the day you were born. I should have told you that every single Sunday instead of just thinking it." Outside, the sun was setting, painting Emma's small living room in golden light. For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt like she could breathe properly, like a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying had finally been lifted from her chest. "So what happens now?" Emma asked. "Now we figure out how to be a family that says what it means and means what it says," Margaret replied, "starting with me telling you how much I love you and how sorry I am that I let you doubt it." Emma leaned into her grandmother's embrace, and Margaret felt the last of the walls between them crumble. This was what family was supposed to feel like. Not perfect, but honest. Not equal, but fair. Not obligated, but chosen. Emma returned to her Sunday visits, but the dynamic between them had shifted in ways both profound and subtle. There was a new honesty in their conversations, a willingness to address difficulties instead of pretending everything was fine. Emma no longer felt like she had to earn her place in Margaret's life with perfect service, and Margaret no longer felt like acknowledging her needs would burden Emma beyond bearing. But change, even positive change, rarely happens in isolation. 2 weeks after their reconciliation, Margaret received a phone call that reminded her that family dynamics are never simple equations with clean solutions. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something." David's voice carried a tension she hadn't heard since he was a teenager, confronting her about some perceived injustice. "Sarah ran into Emma at the grocery store yesterday, and Emma mentioned that you'd made some changes to your will." Margaret's stomach tightened. She'd planned to tell David about the changes herself, but she'd been putting off the conversation, unsure how to explain her reasoning without making him feel diminished or punished. "Yes, I did make some adjustments," she said carefully. "Adjustments?" David's tone was flat. "Is that what you're calling giving Emma the house and cutting my inheritance by more than half?" Margaret closed her eyes. Emma must have been excited about the reconciliation and let something slip without thinking about how the information might travel through the family network. It wasn't malicious. Emma had probably just been relieved to have her grandmother back and hadn't considered the political implications of sharing the news. "David, I was planning to discuss this with you in person. This isn't how I wanted you to find out. But it's true, you're giving Emma most of the estate. I'm giving Emma a larger share, yes. She's earned it through years of devoted care and sacrifice. Sacrifices I'm only now beginning to understand the full scope of." The silence stretched long enough that Margaret wondered if the call had dropped. When David finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled the way it got when he was trying not to lose his temper. "I see. And what exactly did I do to deserve having my inheritance cut? Was I not a good enough son? Did I not visit enough, call enough, care enough?" The hurt in his voice cut through Margaret's chest like a knife. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of, that correcting one injustice would create another, that recognizing Emma's contributions would feel like punishment to David. "This isn't about punishment, David. It's about recognition. Emma has been my primary caregiver for 3 years. She's sacrificed job opportunities, personal relationships, her own independence to make sure I wasn't alone. And what about my sacrifices? What about working 60-hour weeks to support my family so that I could also help support you when needed? What about the stress of worrying about you from a distance, knowing I couldn't be there as much as I wanted to be?" Margaret felt the familiar tug of guilt, the same feeling that had paralyzed her for months. David wasn't wrong. He did work hard. He did worry about her. He was a good son in his own way. But his sacrifices were different from Emma's, less immediate, less daily, less visible. "David, I know you love me. I know you care. But Emma has been here, physically present, carrying the day-to-day burden of my aging. That has value, and it should be recognized. So this is about physical proximity? About who lives closest? Mom, I moved to Chicago for my career, to build a life for my family. I thought you were proud of what I'd accomplished. I am proud of you. This isn't about punishment or preference, it's about fairness. Real fairness, not just equal distribution. And you don't think it's fair to consider that I've been financially successful partially so I could help you if you ever needed it. That I've built a stable life specifically so I could be a resource for the family." The conversation was spiraling into exactly the kind of family competition Margaret had been trying to avoid. Each of them was defending their own version of love and duty, their own claim to recognition and reward. "David, can you come over this weekend? This is too important to discuss over the phone." "I'm not sure I want to, Mom. I'm pretty hurt right now. And honestly, I'm angry. It feels like you've made a decision about my worth based on information you never bothered to gather." After they hung up, Margaret sat in her kitchen feeling like she'd traded one family crisis for another. She'd repaired her relationship with Emma by acknowledging the reality of their dynamic, but in doing so, she'd damaged her relationship with David by seemingly dismissing his own form of love and contribution. The phone rang again an hour later. This time it was Emma, and she sounded distressed. "Grandma, I think I messed up. I was so happy about us talking again, and when I ran into Sarah at the store, I mentioned that you'd changed your will. I didn't think about how that would sound, or that she'd tell Uncle David right away. It's okay, sweetheart. He was going to find out eventually. Better that it happened sooner rather than later. But he called you, didn't he? And he was upset." Margaret could hear the guilt in Emma's voice, the familiar tendency to take responsibility for family discord that wasn't entirely her fault. "He was surprised and hurt, yes, but that's not your fault, Emma. These are conversations I should have had before making changes, not after. Do you regret it? Changing the will, I mean." Margaret considered the question carefully. Did she regret recognizing Emma's contributions? Did she regret trying to create a more just distribution of her assets? Or did she regret the complexity and pain that seemed to accompany every attempt to balance competing claims of love and fairness? "I don't regret recognizing what you've meant to me," she said finally, "but I do regret that it came at the cost of hurting David. I need to figure out how to make this right with him, without undoing what I've made right with you." That weekend, David came to visit, bringing Sarah and the kids with him, as if their presence might provide a buffer against the difficult conversation he was dreading. Margaret had prepared for this meeting like a diplomatic summit, thinking through various approaches and potential compromises. They all gathered in the living room that had seen so many family celebrations and crises over the years. Tyler and his younger sister Megan played quietly with their tablets, while the adults navigated the minefield of family inheritance politics. "I've been thinking about our conversation all week," David began, his tone more measured than it had been on the phone. "And I want you to know that I'm not angry about Emma getting more. She has been here more, and I can understand why that would matter to you." Margaret felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this could be resolved without the family fracturing completely. "But," David continued, "I am hurt that you made this decision without talking to me, without asking about my perspective, my constraints, my own sacrifices. It feels like you wrote me off as the absent son, without ever asking why I was absent or what that cost me." Sarah reached over and squeezed David's hand, a gesture of support that reminded Margaret how family loyalty can take many forms. "You're right," Margaret admitted. "I made assumptions about your choices without understanding your perspective. That wasn't fair. I turned down a promotion 2 years ago that would have required relocating to California," David said quietly. "Not because I didn't want the career advancement, but because I didn't want to be further away from you. I never told you because I didn't want you to feel guilty or responsible for my career decisions." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. David had made his own sacrifices, his own quiet choices to prioritize family over personal advancement. She'd been so focused on Emma's visible daily care that she'd missed David's less obvious but equally real constraints. "I didn't know," she said softly. "I know you didn't, just like I didn't know about Emma turning down the job in Seattle. We're all making sacrifices and choices, but we're not talking about them. We're just assuming the others can see and understand what we're doing." Emma, who had been quiet through most of the conversation, finally spoke up. "Maybe the problem isn't the will. Maybe the problem is that we've all been trying to prove we love each other, instead of just saying it." Her simple observation cut through the complexity of inheritance law and family politics to the heart of the matter. They were all so busy demonstrating their devotion that they'd forgotten to communicate their love directly. "What if," Margaret said slowly, "instead of trying to perfectly calibrate my will to reflect everyone's contributions, I focused on making sure everyone knows how much they're valued while I'm still here to tell them." The conversation that followed was unlike any they'd ever had as a family. David talked about the stress of long-distance caregiving, the helplessness of worrying about Margaret's well-being from hours away. Emma talked about the loneliness of being the only one consistently present, the weight of responsibility she'd carried alone. Margaret talked about her fear of being a burden, her difficulty asking for help, her gratitude for both their visible and invisible sacrifices. By the end of the afternoon, they'd worked out a new arrangement. Margaret would adjust the will again, giving Emma the house and a larger share of the financial assets, but ensuring David's inheritance reflected his own contributions and sacrifices. More importantly, they'd established new patterns of communication, regular family calls, shared caregiving responsibilities, and honest conversations about needs and limitations. "I wish Grandpa could see this," Emma said, as they all hugged goodbye. "He always said family was messy but worth fighting for." Margaret smiled, feeling Harold's presence in the warm chaos of multiple generations gathered in their living room, working through problems instead of avoiding them. Maybe this was what he'd meant about fighting for family. Not the absence of conflict, but the willingness to work through it with love and honesty. As she watched David's car pull out of the driveway, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in months. Peace, not the brittle peace of unexamined assumptions, but the deeper peace that comes from knowing that love, when expressed honestly and received generously, really can overcome the complicated mathematics of fairness and recognition. Sometimes the most powerful inheritance we can leave isn't money or property, but the knowledge that we were truly seen and valued. If this story is touching something in your own family experience, I'd love to hear which part of the world you're watching from. These dynamics seem to exist everywhere, don't they? 6 months later, Margaret stood in her kitchen preparing Sunday dinner for the first time in years. The routine had evolved from Emma's solo visits to something richer and more complex, a genuine family gathering that rotated between different homes but always centered on connection rather than obligation. Today was Margaret's turn to host, and the familiar sounds of family preparation filled the house. Emma was in the garden, picking tomatoes and herbs for the salad, while David and Tyler worked together to fix the squeaky hinge on the back door that had been bothering Margaret for months. Sarah was helping Megan arrange flowers from Harold's rose garden, which was now thriving under the collective care of multiple family members. The changes hadn't happened overnight. There had been awkward moments, hurt feelings that took time to heal, and new patterns that required conscious effort to maintain. But gradually, they'd found their rhythm as a family that chose honesty over politeness, that valued presence over perfection, and that measured love in attention rather than achievements. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Janet in Phoenix. "How's the family dinner prep going? Wish I could be there." The relationship with her sister had deepened too, as they'd begun having regular conversations about family, aging, and the complexities of love across generations. "Everything smells amazing in here," Emma called out as she entered through the back door, her arms full of fresh vegetables and herbs. She moved through Margaret's kitchen with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged there, but also with the confidence of someone who knew her belonging was recognized and valued. "Your grandfather would be so proud of this," Margaret said, gesturing toward the window where she could see 3 generations of her family working together in the yard he'd loved so much. "Do you think he would have understood? About changing the will, I mean." Margaret considered the question, one they'd talked about several times over the past months. "I think he would have understood that love isn't static, that families have to grow and change and adapt to new realities. He always said the most important thing was that we chose each other, not just put up with each other." Emma smiled, rinsing the tomatoes at the sink. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about choice. I used to feel like I was taking care of you because I had to, because that's what good granddaughters do. But now it feels different, more like something I want to do because it makes my life richer." "What changed?" "You started seeing me, really seeing me, not just appreciating what I did for you, but understanding what it cost me and why I chose to do it anyway." Emma paused in her vegetable washing. "And I started seeing you too, not just as someone who needed care, but as someone who was scared of being a burden, who was trying to balance love and fairness in an impossible situation." Through the window, Margaret watched David teaching Tyler how to use a level to hang a new bird feeder. The sight filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the August heat. David had started coming by every other weekend, not out of duty, but because he'd discovered that spending time with his mother was actually enjoyable, when it wasn't clouded by guilt and unspoken expectations. The biggest surprise had been how much he'd needed the connection too. His job was demanding, his life in Chicago was busy and successful, but something had been missing. The sense of belonging to something larger than his immediate nuclear family. The regular visits had given him that, along with giving Tyler and Megan the chance to really know their grandmother, instead of just seeing her as an obligation on holidays. "Mom, where do you want this?" David asked, carrying the new bird feeder through the back door. "Right outside the kitchen window, so I can watch the cardinals while I have my morning coffee." "Cardinals were Grandpa's favorite, weren't they?" Tyler chimed in from behind his father. "They were. He used to say they were good luck, especially when they came in pairs." As if summoned by their conversation, 2 bright red cardinals landed on the fence that bordered Margaret's yard, their presence a benediction on the day. The dinner itself was everything Margaret had hoped it would be, chaotic and warm, filled with overlapping conversations and shared stories. Tyler regaled them with tales from his baseball season, while Megan showed off her latest art project. Sarah talked about her mother's improving health, and David shared news about a promotion at work, one he'd accepted this time because he no longer felt like taking career opportunities meant abandoning family obligations. Emma had brought her new boyfriend, Marcus, a fellow nurse she'd met at the hospital. Margaret had been nervous about meeting him, protective of Emma's happiness in a way that surprised her with its intensity. But Marcus fit easily into their family dynamic, helping with dishes without being asked, and listening with genuine interest to Tyler's detailed explanation of baseball statistics. "So this is where Emma gets her stubborn streak," Marcus said with a grin as Emma and Margaret debated the proper way to season green beans. "Stubborn?" Margaret protested. "I prefer principled." "That's exactly what Emma said when I accused her of being stubborn about taking time off work," Marcus laughed. "Some things are worth being stubborn about," Emma said, bumping Margaret's shoulder affectionately. As the afternoon wound down and dishes were cleared, Margaret found herself thinking about legacy in ways she never had before. For so long she'd thought about what she would leave behind in terms of property and financial assets, as if love could be quantified and distributed through legal documents. But sitting in her living room, watching her family play a complicated board game that involved much good-natured arguing and laughter, Margaret realized that the most important things couldn't be willed to anyone. They had to be lived, shared, and chosen every day. "Grandma, it's your turn," Megan said, holding out the dice. Margaret rolled and moved her game piece, landing on a space that required her to answer a question about family traditions. "What's a tradition you hope your family continues after you're gone?" Tyler read from the card. The question hung in the air, more profound than the game's creators had probably intended. Margaret looked around the room at the faces that had become so precious to her. Emma's bright attention, David's relaxed smile, Sarah's gentle presence, the children's uncomplicated joy, Marcus's warm inclusion in their circle. "This," she said simply, "I hope you keep choosing each other. I hope you keep showing up, not because you have to, but because you want to. I hope you keep having the hard conversations and the easy ones too." "That's not really a tradition," Tyler pointed out with the literal mindedness of a 12-year-old. "Isn't it?" Margaret asked. "Choosing to be together, choosing to work through problems instead of avoiding them, choosing to say what we mean and mean what we say. That seems like the most important tradition of all." As the sun began to set, casting golden light through the windows of the house that had seen so much life and love and loss, Margaret felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with legal documents or inheritance planning. She'd managed to give her family something more valuable than money or property. She'd given them the knowledge that their love mattered, that their choices were seen and appreciated, that they belonged to something worth fighting for. The evening ended with hugs and promises to call during the week, with plans for next month's gathering at David's house in Chicago, with the easy intimacy of a family that had learned to be honest with each other. After everyone left, Margaret and Emma sat on the front porch, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't fought about the will?" Emma asked. Margaret considered the question. "I think we would have continued on the way we were, loving each other but not really seeing each other clearly. You would have kept sacrificing without acknowledgement, and I would have kept accepting your care without understanding its true cost. And now we know what we mean to each other. Now the love is conscious instead of just assumed." Emma leaned against Margaret's shoulder, the gesture as natural as breathing. "I'm glad we fought. I'm glad you were stubborn enough to make me fight for recognition, and I'm glad I was stubborn enough to demand it. Harold always said that anything worth having was worth fighting for, even family, especially family." As they sat together in the comfortable silence of people who had found their way back to each other, Margaret thought about the phone call that had started it all, Emma's hurt voice demanding recognition, her own defensive response, the terrible silence that had followed. It seemed impossible that such pain could have led to such peace, that conflict could have been the pathway to deeper love. But maybe that was what growing older taught you, that love wasn't a fixed quantity to be divided equally, but a renewable resource that expanded when it was truly seen and consciously chosen. That fairness wasn't about mathematical precision, but about making sure everyone felt valued for their unique contributions. That family wasn't something you were born into and then took for granted, but something you chose to create and recreate every day. The story of Margaret's will would eventually become family legend, told and retold at future gatherings as an example of how love, when tested, can emerge stronger and more honest than before. But the real legacy wouldn't be found in any legal document. It would be found in the Sunday dinners that brought them together, in the honest conversations that replaced polite assumptions, and in the daily choice to see and value each other's love in all its complicated, imperfect, irreplaceable forms. Sometimes, the most important inheritance we can leave is the knowledge that we were truly known and deeply cherished. And sometimes the most precious gift we can give ourselves is the courage to fight for that recognition while there's still time to enjoy it.